Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in a minute or two. We're just waiting for the rest of the attendees to join. While you are getting set up, if you want to type into the chat where you're watching from, it's always nice to see where everyone is watching the webinar from. Now that we're online, we're getting a lot more people that are not just based in Central New Jersey, so it's always cool to see. Last week we had like in Ontario and Florida. So go ahead and type in where you're from so we can see where you are. I like some of the nicknames you've chosen for the attendees. I see a bee's knees in here. I see a bee's needs. So I like the punny nicknames.
Yeah, that's honestly why I like the title, Meeting Bees Needs, just because the way it sounds. I might have to click out of the chat window while I'm doing my presentation because it covers a bit of
Yeah,
my
that's fine.
screen.
I can relay some of the questions to you while we're going.
Okay.
All right. So, hi everyone. My name is Jeff Geist. I am the programs coordinator at Duke Farms. This is one of the classes in our series of Monarch and Meadow Month classes related to pollinators and meadows and native plants, things like that. So this is our class on bees, and Dr. Russell is going to be presenting. Before we get started, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Zoom usage, things like that. This is a webinar, so you are automatically muted and your videos are off. So if you have any questions or anything you want to say, any comments, stuff like that, go ahead and either type it into the chat or in the Q&A section. If there's time at the end, we'll go over some of the questions and see how far we get. So go ahead and keep typing them in, and at the end, I will read off the questions to Dr. Russell. So I think that is it from me. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Russell. She is from the Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources Department at Rutgers. It's actually where I did my undergrad. So it's cool that we get to keep this partnership going. And so Dr. Russell is a pollinator ecologist and conservationist, and she's going to talk today about bee threats and wild bees and bees versus wasps and bee conservation and a whole bunch of things. So Dr. Russell, I'm going to mute myself and you can take it away from here.
Brilliant. All right, hello everyone, welcome. And I'm excited to talk to you today about a subject close to my heart, which is wild bees and their conservation. And I'm told that a lot of the other talks in this series have been focusing on butterflies. And though butterflies and bees are both insects, they actually have quite different needs, and the way we approach trying to conserve them in nature is a little bit different. So hopefully for those of you who've been seeing the other webinars, we'll learn a little something this time, so I hope. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to do over the next hour-ish, I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of bees as pollinators. I think that is our general understanding, right, of why we should care about bees. But, you know, as you'll see, there's a lot of other really cool stuff about bees that you will learn about. And then I'm going to talk about natural histories of bees, which, you know, what their habits are, why they're so good at pollination, what makes them such good pollinators. I'm going to give you some information about the diversity of bees and hopefully expand your recognition of the bees that you might see in your backyard and some fun facts. Then I'll review a little bit about what we know about current threats to bees and bee populations, and then wrap it up with meeting bees' needs. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my work and how I try to promote wild bee populations, and then I'm going to give you some advice of things that you can do. But even just being here and being informed is really helpful, and I think you can help spread the word from what you've learned here as well, and that would be very useful. So bees, what are they good for? Well, you probably are aware if you're here, I'm guessing, but they are the most important animal pollinator of both native and cultivated vegetation in the world. Monetarily, they're crazy important, anywhere from $14 to $40 billion annually, $100 to $200 billion globally. Meaning that, and that's a little bit of a fudge, but that just means that without bees, that's how much we would lose in terms of crop production. Roughly 80% of fruit crops benefit from insect pollination, and that accounts to about 35% of global food production. If you're looking just at bees, it's probably closer to 30% instead of 35, maybe 25. But again, bees are really the workhorses, the working class of the pollinator world. They get the most done. So I have some just titles of research articles down here to make a couple of points. One thing you might notice, a common theme in these is the reference to wild bees. So wild bee pollinators provide the majority of crop visitation. Species richness of wild bees, wild pollinators enhancing fruit set. And I'm throwing this up here to plant a little seed that I'm going to be talking about not just our friend the honeybee, but actually bees that are native to North America that have traditionally been a little underappreciated in terms of their contribution to agriculture and to nature. So I'm going to talk more about what we mean by richness and diversity and wild bees. And really, it has nothing to do with their attitude. It's about whether they're managed or not. So again, more on bees. What are they good for? Crops that rely on bees, some things, just a smattering of things: almonds, apples, blueberries, tomatoes, squash, lots and lots of fruit. So foods that we enjoy eating, there's a graphic down here from Whole Foods, which might be a little overstated, but you get the idea. Without bees, we would have much lower selection of fruit in the produce aisle. But bees are responsible for pollinating crops like alfalfa and clover that are used for forage for our livestock. So they're not just important for our food choices, but also for the food choices of the animals that we raise. And did I mention coffee? Coffee needs bees. So I'm a big fan of coffee. And so really, if nothing else, if you want to preserve coffee, right, you gotta preserve bees. And in terms of practical implications, I mean, I already told you the monetary value, but just looking at it more specifically, if bee populations are declining, what ends up happening, right, and I'll give you some evidence that they are declining, is that there's going to be higher costs to farmers who need to import honeybees. So honeybees can be brought to farms, but farmers usually pay for that service. And the fewer honeybees there are, the more they pay. And I really was surprised when I started doing research, and I did a project in Wisconsin, and I didn't realize that some of those farmers were paying $40,000 a year for the privilege of having pollinators in having honeybees in their farm fields for a couple weeks a year. So it can be a really high cost. Lower yield in terms of numbers of fruits due to insufficient pollination. So there's something called pollination limitation, which would be a problem. And then even fruits that can be produced without visits by bees, typically if they aren't visited, the fruits are less sweet and they're smaller on average. So you have lower customer satisfaction. So certainly from our perspective, from the agricultural perspective, we want to make sure that bee populations are healthy. But of course, I am an ecologist, so I don't only care about me and humans. Bees are incredibly important for nature, for the wildflowers we see around us, for our gardens, for the things that we like to look at when we go on hikes. So declining bee populations would also result in lower reproductive rates for flowering plants, lower genetic diversity of flowering plants, and even extinction of certain flowering plants in the absence of their animal pollinators. So again, I'll talk a little bit more about details, but many plants are unable to reproduce without the help of an animal pollinator that essentially picks up their version of sperm, which is pollen, and moves it from one individual to another. Some plants are able to reproduce without it, but over time that's bad because they lose genetic diversity and they become less able to withstand stressors. And then, you know, there are certain plant species like this one referred to down here in this article I found, here it is here, where it's actually the plant is more reliant on the animal than the bee is on the plant, such that if conditions are wrong in terms of phenology, and this is true, phenology means the time of year that the plant blooms and the time of year that the bee is active. If those get into a mismatch, sometimes the bee can be fine, it can find other sources of food, but the plants themselves are unable to reproduce. So this is a study, just one study showing a plant that is currently in danger because of a lack of visitation by bees due to climate change. So that's a real issue as well. So let me back up again, because you're probably not all entomologists. So I'm just going to say, bees, what are they? So I teach at Rutgers, I teach invertebrate zoology. So I'm really big on proper naming of the placement of organisms. And so if we're going to be sciencey, they are in the phylum Arthropoda, they are in the class Insecta, the order Hymenoptera, the suborder Apocrita, the superfamily Apoideae, and the class Anthophila. So Anthophila, anthers, right? That makes sense, flower loving. Or we can call them vegetarian wasps, which is a much shorter way to say that. So I'm going to take a minute here. You notice this picture I have. I did not take this picture. There is a group at the USGS, at Patuxent Wildlife Research Center, called the Bee Inventory and Monitoring Laboratory, and they put out these infographics about wild bees. And you're gonna see a lot of pictures. There's actually a big poster, 25 facts, and I've just extracted certain things of them. So I'm borrowing that to make some points and to be able to show you lots of pictures of beautiful diversity of bees. And so anyway, you're going to see more of these. I don't have all 25, but anyway. So bees are actually vegetarian wasps, meaning that they focus exclusively on the collection of pollen and nectar. So this is scary. Okay, so this is something I would show in my invertebrate zoology class. It's a phylogeny. It represents the evolutionary history of the group Hymenoptera. So that whole group, which is an order, and you can see the other names I mentioned, Apocrita, Aculeata, it gets smaller and smaller. And then up here, of course, right now it's blocked by my screen bar, but you see the group Anthophila. So these are bees, right up here, and you can see pollen collecting. That's the important thing right there. And so bees and wasps are related, but they are distinct. So bees are a subgroup that only feeds on flowers and never feeds on animal tissue or rotting fruit or flesh. And you might be surprised to learn that there are 25,000 species of bees in the world, probably more. That's just an estimate because they're not all described. So again, fun fact, if honeybees are all you know little about bees, especially in North America, since honeybees are actually non-native. They were brought over by European settlers. So I saw there were some people outside of New Jersey in attendance today, and I'm sorry, I'm focused on New Jersey because that's where we are. But there are roughly 4,000 species in the continental US, about 400 species in New Jersey. And actually, I saw some people from California. The desert Southwest in the United States is actually the hot spot of bee diversity. And you'll sort of see why. They like dry, well-drained soil. So that's going to be important later on. Just some more pictures here to give you a feel for the diversity of body form, color, they're an amazingly diverse group. So if it's one thing I want from, I hope will come out of this session today in your attendance, is that now, you have all this time to go on nature walks and to go in your backyard and to look at flowers. You're going to start seeing things that you ignored before because you thought maybe they were just flies or you didn't even know what they were. And now you're going to know that they're bees, or you're going to think to yourself, maybe that's a bee. And hopefully that will be exciting for you. So they're very different and they're diverse in their lifestyles. What I mean by that is they might be active at different times of day, different times of year. They have differences in where they build their nests, more on that later. Differences in preferences and how they forage, and even what they actually take from flowers. Some take oils, some take nectar, some take pollen. Usually it's a combination of all three. But they all, defining factor, as I said, Anthophila, is they all visit flowers and they drink the nectar from plants and they eat the pollen. Pollen is high in protein, and so it's a good food source for them. So for this reason, they visit a lot of flowers, but there's other organisms, right, flies and butterflies, that also drink nectar and incidentally get pollen on themselves and can pollinate. But bees are unique. But first, let me just do my other public service here, which is to educate you a little bit on how to tell the difference between bees and wasps, because you're going to go out into the world and you're going to hopefully proselytize about bees, and you're going to reduce your general public's fear of bees, because very often when I tell someone I study bees, the first thing they say is, "Oh, I hate bees, they stung me." And 98% of the time, they're actually talking about a wasp and not a bee. So like I said, technically, you know, I mean, bees are a type of wasp, but they're not really the same thing. So how do you tell the difference? And this is something I have to teach all my incoming students when we first go out collecting, because it's not always obvious. Wasps, typically, as you can see in these pictures, tend to be, have little to no hair. Their bodies tend to be sort of smooth and shiny. They also have very narrow waists that are quite obvious, even if they're just flying by. They also tend to be more brightly colored and what I would say contrasty, meaning black and white and black and red and black and yellow, and those bright colors. And so you can see, I like this graphic here. You can find some kind of mildly offensive memes on the internet if you type in bees versus wasps, and this is a family thing, so I didn't want to have any swearing. So this is a good one. Bees, on the other hand, are quite fuzzy, right? They have a lot of hair. It's another thing that contributes to their utility as pollinators, because the pollen sticks to the hair. So they have lots of hairs. They generally are not aggressive. You know, there are occasional exceptions with honeybees and Africanized honeybees. We're not really going to talk too much about that, but you get the idea. But another clue is how they fly. So bees tend to keep their legs tucked when they fly, but wasps tend to let their legs hang below them when they fly. So these are all some ways you can tell bees from wasps. And then the other thing that's kind of important is stinging frequency, because this is something we care about, right? And here's another one. Many can't sting you. So many bees are actually physically incapable of stinging you because they're just too small. They couldn't break the skin. When a bee stings you, they're basically poking your skin with their ovipositor, which is actually something that only female bees have anyway. So first off, only half of them can sting you anyway. So males can't sting. But a lot of them are just too small to even pierce the skin. And a lot of them, they just wouldn't really bother because it's not worth the energy to produce the venom that's in the sting to waste on you if you're not a predator and they don't feel threatened. So anyway, so just, you know, whereas wasps, you know, they are able to sting repeatedly very quickly without a huge cost to them. And so they inject less venom with each sting, but they can sting more frequently. Bees, honeybees, many of you know, the stinger is barbed, and so they die when they sting you. So that is a big deterrent for them. Although, you know, if you study bee behavior, you can understand why they do it. Other bees, they're not barbed, the stingers aren't barbed, but even so, it's a big risk and a big cost to them. So most of them are not going to sting. Okay, let's get back to pollination, right? So bees have evolved morphologically, specifically structures to help them carry pollen. And so you have two main types of pollen carrying structures in bees. One are called scopa, or scopi, which is also called pollen brooms. And they can either be located in the underbelly of the abdomen or on one of the back legs. And so these are just hairs that are designed to hold pollen. And so some bees you fly by, you look at the underbelly and it's like bright purple because they've been foraging on purple pollen and it would be under their bellies. Others, you're going to see it on their back legs. Now, other types of bees, especially bumblebees and honeybees, which are ones that are probably most familiar to you guys, have something called corbicula. These are pollen baskets, and these are essentially little containers on their legs surrounded by hairs to which they can attach balls of pollen and carry it. So anyway, they've evolved these structures to make them better able to carry pollen. So why do they pack pollen? Well, so that's packing pollen. So I told you before, they can just eat pollen and drink nectar, and that's what male bees do. And they get pollen on themselves, on their fur, that then they can transfer from pollen, from flower to flower. So they can pollinate either because they're visiting for themselves or visiting to pack. But if they're visiting to pack, what they're doing is they're provisioning their nest. So this is something that female bees do. They gather pollen and they bring it back to their nests. They form it into little food balls and they leave it for their babies. So I love this one, 25 facts. Most females are single moms who seal their children in cells and never return. Sam Droege, who is the guy who runs the USGS BIML lab, has a sense of humor. So I love this, but it is kind of true. So this is, we think of bees and we think of hives, like honeybee hives, but that's very unusual in the bee world. Most bees live on their own. One female makes a nest for herself and her family. She might make multiple nests, but she doesn't really live there. What she does is you'll see more about this later, she will make a pollen and nectar ball. She'll lay an egg on it, and then she'll make a little division, and then she'll do another pollen ball and lay an egg. And what happens is the egg hatches, you get a little bee maggot, if you will, a little larvae that then just slowly consumes the pollen and nectar ball until they reach adult stages and they're able to break out of the nest and fly away. So the moms just leave food for their kids, they don't stick around. But in order to do this, that's pretty much all the female bees do once they come out and mate. All they want to do is provision for those nests. And so they just visit flowers, visit flowers, visit flowers to get enough to lay as many eggs as they can in a given season and build as many nests as they possibly can. And so because of the fact that they are on this time crunch to gather this for their babies, you know, they are busy bees. And so that fact that females have that drive means that they're going to visit more bees, so they're going to be responsible for more pollination, just because of the fact that it's so closely tied to their own success reproductively. Okay, as I mentioned, the lifestyle differences in different types of bee, one thing that differs between the groups of bees is where they like to build their nests, right? So each individual female has a particular preference for where she wants to build a nest, and that's usually consistent within a species, but it can vary between species or between genera or family. And so one type of bee are the mason and the leaf cutters. And I'm gonna play you a little video of this. It's not my video, I didn't create it, but it has such good footage and such good information that I think you'll benefit from seeing it. And it gives you a real up close look at what females are doing when they are constructing their nests. So here we go, hopefully it's gonna come through okay. It's about 4 or 5 minutes, I might stop it early.
What's this bee up to, digging around in the mud? This blue orchard bee is a mason, a builder. Her material is, you guessed it, mud, and she works alone. In fact, unlike those honeybee hives you might think of, most of the 4,000 types of bees in North America are solitary. See how she scrapes the wet earth? She collects it with 2 huge pincer-like tools on her face called mandibles. She's gathering mud to make her nest. The nest is long and thin. In nature, she goes into places like hollow twigs. At the University of California, Davis, she uses a 6-inch long paper straw provided by researchers. In this nest without a straw, you can see how she builds a wall of mud. Then she gathers food from spring flowers, but not only to feed herself. See the pretty purple pollen on the anther of this flower? She grabs the anthers with her legs and rubs the pollen onto hairs on her abdomen called scopa. And while she's at it, she sips a little nectar from the blooms. When she climbs back into her nest, she turns the pollen and nectar into a sweet morsel next to the mud wall. On this purple ball, she lays a single egg. She repeats this several times in her narrow nest. Egg, wall, egg, wall. When she's done, she seals it all up with more mud. A cross-section of the nest shows her incredible craftsmanship. It looks like a piece of jewelry. Soon the eggs hatch. The hungry larvae feed on their pollen provision, the purple lunchbox their mom packed for them.
I'm just going to stop that there because that's really what I wanted to show you. So most bees, when they make a nest, will line it with some material. Usually that's in part to keep moisture out. So I mentioned how the high diversity of bees in the desert Southwest. One thing that bees have to worry about is moisture getting in and mold because of the amount of time that the babies spend in the nest over across the seasons. Oops, sorry. There are other bees, most bees, as you can see in this graphic, actually nest in the ground. And so it's a similar idea to the ones you saw before, but again, they're going down into the soil. And each cell is kind of a little bobble off the end. There are other ground nesters that have more, that actually partition, like the others that I showed you, but this gives you an idea. But the same basic idea, they have this ball of nectar and pollen, they lay the egg, and then once they've laid all the eggs they can lay in a particular nest, they leave and they do a temporary seal to hide the entrance, because bee nests are vulnerable to predators and parasites. And so the last thing they want are one of those to go down and eat either the pollen ball they've made for their own eggs or the eggs themselves. Other bees are called carpenters because they're more similar to the masons that I showed you before, but carpenters actually excavate the holes more aggressively compared to the masons that are usually finding already existing holes. Most of us are familiar with carpenter bees because they live around human habitations. They like our wooden decks and chairs. And unfortunately, they kind of get a bad rap for it. People think they're like termites and that they're going to destroy your deck. And most pest control companies will tell you you have to get rid of them or it will be doomsday. Well, I got to say, I've been in my current house for 6 years and we're in the countryside. We have a big old wooden deck and we have carpenter bees and we've never treated them. We just let them go and their population has not exploded and nothing has been destroyed. I mean, it's up to you. If you don't want them living with you, that's fine. You can go online and find lots of methods to get rid of them. But honestly, their populations are usually pretty stable and the damage is minimal. One thing though, another public service thing for you, if you come across somebody who's terrified of carpenter bees because they are quite large and they do seem aggressive because they will fly right around. They do not seem to be fearful of you. 98% of the time, the ones that are flying around are males and they're being territorial. They have a little area, right, that is their territory that they want a female to come to so that he can mate with her and then she can build a nest. He's being defensive about other male bees and he treats any humans as though they are male bees and a competitor, and so he'll fly in your face. And it's kind of scary, but they're males. And so they don't have a stinger. They are physically incapable of harming you. You can confirm that they're males because they have a little bit of yellow on their face, which is clearly visible because they're quite large. There's other carpenter bees that exist that are quite small on the opposite end of the spectrum. These are Ceratina, and they tend to nest in twigs. They will excavate out woody stems and build their nests in there. They're quite small. And here's a predator lurking. So they do have to watch. That's going to become a little bit more relevant later. One more fun fact about bees. I could go on all day, but I don't have time. So I wanted to mention this one thing, not because it relates to pollination really or to conservation, but because I think it's kind of interesting and it's a riddle. So males have no father, but have a grandfather. So bees, like other hymenopterans, exhibit something called haplodiploidy, which means that males come from unfertilized eggs. So again, most animals that we're familiar with, that we live with, especially mammals, are diploid, meaning we have two sets of chromosomes, and we rely on fertilization of two haploid gametes to get an individual. But for bees, only the females are diploid. The males are haploid. And so female bees can produce males without actually having to mate themselves. It's kind of fascinating and kind of interesting. But anyway, that's it for my random fun fact. Let's get back to the subject at hand. Okay, so as I mentioned, you know, what are the current threats to bees? How healthy are bee communities currently? And there's no easy answer, other than the fact that we have pretty good reason to believe that they are under threat and their populations are declining. But let's back up a minute. There aren't a lot of targeted bee monitoring programs. There's actually more now in the last decade, but there's very little historical data. And that makes it really difficult to track changes. So you can say, okay, well, let's look more broadly at all insects, because there are insect surveys. Well, there's also not a lot of insect surveys because their diversity is so high. It's so labor intensive to do monitoring that, again, we only have spotty data even for just insects. But you probably saw on the news really terrifying headlines. This is last year before the pandemic, and you know, when other news made it into the media, all these headlines: insect apocalypse, you know, the fact that arthropods are declining, especially insects, in lots of landscapes. There's a couple big papers out. And I have good news and bad news. I mean, the good news is that we're really not looking at an apocalypse, probably. Yes, insect abundance has declined, and there's a lot of species out there that rely on having an overabundance of insects. There's lots of insectivorous birds, mammals, spiders, other things that rely on having high numbers of insects. But they're probably not going to like all massively go extinct, right? So we're not really dealing with apocalypse, but their numbers have been declining, and certain types, especially in terrestrial systems, have seen big crashes. The slightly better news is that there was a study just released a couple of days ago that tried to use the spotty and incomplete data we have for North America to see what the situation is like in North America, and found that it's not as bad as in Europe, apparently, right? That we seem to still be at the stage where, you know, insect groups, a lot of them are declining, but not by much. And more species are stable than are declining. The data isn't quite as good. So anyway, that's why, one of the reasons why the data is incomplete and difficult to answer this question is just because it takes so much time and energy to sample arthropods because there are so many different species. We do, however, have good information from honeybees because they are managed and they're a multi-million, billion-dollar industry. So people keep track of how they're doing. And so there was a big scare, again, for those of you a little bit older, probably remember, especially in the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s, big declines in honeybees across the world, some places worse than others. US saw a big decline right here, right after parasitic mites were introduced into the US. And then there was the colony collapse disorder you probably saw in the news, which is a phenomenon that I'm not going to get into too much, but drove down populations of honeybees. And this is a pretty global phenomenon experienced by bees across the world, and it's complicated. The slightly better news is that since that time, honeybee colony levels have remained relatively stable. But I will say this, they're in part stable because of the mitigating factors that people that care for honeybees are engaging in. So there's still a really high loss rate. So if you are a beekeeper, or you know a beekeeper, you know that we've just come to expect lots of losses. But because we're managing them, because we can care for them, we can bring their populations back. We can create new colonies. We can buy new queens. And so with lots of effort, we've been able to maintain some level of stability. But again, there's some parts of the world where there's still big declines happening in honeybees. So let's take the honeybees is only one species. So let's look at non-honeybees. And there's some data from the Northeast US that has looked at museum specimens and looked for patterns over time. And they found some declines across species, and this is just one example of a non-bombus. So they're separating out bumblebees from other bees. Bumblebees are also a little bit of a outlier because they're social. And so they live in colonies like a honeybee, not quite the same, but similar. And they're not solitary like the other bees. So that's why we so often separate them out in analyses. And this was a paper just out last year that did a similar analysis with more data and found that more than a dozen wild bee species are declining in northeastern US. And that unfortunately, a lot of the species that are declining are some of the big hitters in terms of agricultural pollination. So we have some data from the Northeast US, but a lot of it is from museum specimens, which is not great. But, you know, one other criteria is the Endangered Species Act. It's very difficult to get species on the endangered species list. You have to provide a lot of data. And so insects rarely make it on just because it's difficult to provide enough data. And also it's difficult to really know when they're in danger because their populations tend to be really high overall. But we did see the rusty patch bumblebee added to the endangered species list. And you also had, I think, 7 species of Hawaiian bee added to the endangered species list. And so we're starting to get more data, and the data is not great, right? You know, there are species that are declining of wild bees. We have much better data in Europe just because they have more of a history of counting things, I would say. It's a smaller area too. They also get a lot of community involvement, especially in bumblebee monitoring. And we have not quite gotten off the ground here. And there's been some good studies. This was one I'm just as an example, parallel declines in pollinators and insect pollinated plants in Britain and the Netherlands. Really fascinating, tying the decline of insects and the plants they pollinate in agricultural systems, and just showing the linkage there, which is, you know, terrifying but interesting. So I'm not going to give you any more data right now. There's some other good papers that have looked at this issue. But I want to talk a minute about, you know, why, like what actually causes these bee populations to decline? What is responsible for some of these patterns we see? And I think this is a nice graphic just because it gives you kind of an overall and kind of emphasizes different levels. And these are different levels of intervention as well as threat. And so, you know, here, if you imagine a single species of bee, what determines its population size has a little bit to do with how quickly it reproduces, its foraging range, whether it's a specialist or whether it's a generalist, and then whether it has this genetic variability, which we know is important. And then there's some direct effects, things that can affect populations more directly, like the abundance of food, which in bees' case would be floral abundance. Do they have access to food across the season? Are they limited in terms of nest sites? And so, you know, these are different types of things that can impact and cause declines of populations if they're limited by food, places to live, places to eat, timing of leap. And then of course, on another level, you see land management, how much of land is in like monoculture agriculture or development, how much is in land that is both natural and open, not tree covered, those sorts of questions, disturbances like pollution and fire. Invasive species can also play a role in terms of bee population. So this is just giving you a little schematic of things that affect or determine whether bees are healthy or not. I think probably the general consensus is that monoculture landscapes, agricultural monocultures are the big problem. Between that and the fact that we have this tendency to either develop land either into agriculture or into human habitation, or we let it grow back into forest. So we're going to get to there in a minute. And this is just, many of you may have heard concern about chemicals and their impacts on wild bees, or, you know, bees generally, or also obviously butterflies as well are susceptible to this. And so again, this is another schematic, just looking at the interplay, because it's very difficult to find a smoking gun in one single chemical that's causing problems. But what the research seems to be indicating is that you have a confluence of events. You have maybe poor diet that compromises immunity. You have limited or monotonous flora resources that sort of basically make the bees less able to fight off parasites and pathogens and make them so lower their immunity to these things. And then you have these other chemicals that sometimes directly kill them, but then other times you have them synergistic effects. And so they found that a lot of bees are vulnerable to fungicides, and it's unclear of whether the fungicides are operating to increase the toxicity of other chemicals, or if it has something to do with a symbiotic relationship with fungi. There's some really interesting research questions here, but this is just showing you how the fact that it's never usually one thing that is the problem, and that makes it more difficult to build a resistance or to combat the problems, because it's usually a lot of things. Parasites and pathogens are more likely to affect social bees like bumblebees, honeybees. There's other species of social bee out there, but again, all bees are going to be impacted to a certain degree by chemicals in the environment. And so we know this to be true. There's more and more studies that have shown these impacts and the interaction between them that causes and drives bee populations down. So just a quick summary. I realize that was a very brief overview, but right now domestic honeybee populations are pretty stable, but they have high loss rates, and it requires a lot of input and energy on the parts of beekeepers to keep those populations stable. We don't really see wild honeybee populations in the US. You don't go into the woods and see a honeybee hive. You occasionally see swarms, and that's when honeybees want to move from one kept hive to another place. It's an instinctual thing that they do, but you don't see wild hives anymore. And it kind of makes sense, because again, the reason why honeybees are doing great is because we have people dedicated, right, to making them healthy, right? Beekeepers will give their bees antivirals, antibacterials, antibiotics. We'll give them, we'll protect them from mites. We'll really do everything they can. We'll give them food in the winter. So more on that in a minute. But there's a growing body of research that's documenting wild bee declines in US and Europe, with the threats being parasites, diseases, habitat alteration or limitation, and the use of pesticides, all acting together in sort of a synergy. So what can we do to help? This is the last part, right? Which is probably more fun because it gives you some tasks, things you can do to help the situation. Well, we got to give bees what they need, right? That's the way we're going to increase their populations, and that's the way we're going to increase the pollination services that they provide. So what do they need? Well, they need flowers. They need flora resources. They need something to eat. They need nesting habitat, right? They need a place to live. And they need to be safe from pesticides and chemicals, okay? So that's our goal. That's what we got to do if we want to protect wild bee populations. Now, with honeybees, which are domesticated, as I mentioned, we do this, right? We give them a hive, which is essentially their equivalent of a nesting site. We allow them access to flora resources by bringing them around. A lot of beekeepers will move their hives around to make sure their bees have access to adequate flowers, either in agricultural fields or power line rights of way or other areas. We take their honey and then we provide them with winter food. We medicate them for mites and viruses. We protect them from pesticides, and we battle other diseases. Now, I just wanted to make one point. When I was living in England for a year, when my husband was on sabbatical, and we went to visit a farm, and it was fascinating. It was a class trip for the little kindergartners, and I was a chaperone. So we're at the farm, and my ears perk up whenever they start talking about bees. And the farmer was saying that they are mandated by law to notify all beekeepers within a certain radius, I don't remember how, when it's time, when they're going to be spraying either pesticides or herbicides on their crop. Mostly pesticides, I think. And so that the beekeepers can keep the bees in, right? Can basically shut the door and keep them in and minimize damage so the bees are not actually in the field when they're being sprayed with chemicals. And of course, all I'm thinking is, well, who's going to tell the bumblebees? Nobody's telling the bumblebees. Nobody's telling the carpenter bees. Nobody's telling the other bees that aren't managed not to go in the fields, right? So, that's a problem, right? So honeybees, I'm not personally going to talk much more about honeybees. The next couple of slides where I'm going to be wrapping up, I'm focusing on what we can do to protect wild bees. And that's partly because there's a ton of people and a ton of money being put towards working on the problem of honeybees, right? They're working on it. Penn State, my gosh, they've got an amazing research program out there. So lots of people are working to solve the honeybee problem. And, you know, more generally, I feel that a holistic approach where we're trying to protect pollinators as a group across many, many hundreds of species is a more stable approach. Because then if any one species runs into a problem, there's other species that can pick up the slack, right? So this is why another fact, number 24, if honeybees disappear, can wild bees pollinate our fruits and vegetables? In most cases, the answer is yes. Again, we brought honeybees here. Before honeybees, the native bees were pollinating the plants. And so in many studies that have been done, they can, you know, wild bees can do that job. You just have to provide a place for them to live and food for them that's not only in the farm field. So that gets a little tricky, but we'll get to that in a minute. Oh, and here's my little psst. Honeybees can't pollinate tomatoes or eggplants, and they suck at pumpkins, cherries, blueberries, and cranberries, and they're totally alien invaders. So shh, you didn't hear from me, but okay, you totally heard it from me. But anyway, so that's no, I love honeybees. I gotta say, I talk about honeybees in every single one of my classes. They're fascinating, amazing, and I love them, but they're also not native. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about wild bees then, about native bees in America. What can we do? Well, I already said, but there's some important details you still have to know. Floral resources, right? You know, it's not enough to just plant flowers that all flower at once and then disappear, right? They have to be available throughout the season. Bees typically are only flying and foraging for about 5 weeks. The rest of the time, they're just hanging out in the nest, either developing or waiting. So they have a very brief window. And so this is a life cycle of a bee. And so they're only adults visiting flowers for just a really narrow period of time. So when they, and that is, you know, this is across, these are all different bee species that are coming at different times of year. So if you want to promote the community of bees, right, you need to provide food across the whole season. It can't just be one burst when the crops are flowering. They need to have other things to eat in other times of year, or for the whole time that they're active. So that's an important thing you have to consider when thinking about ways to promote bee populations. And then nesting habitat. Okay, well, I'm going to tell you about nesting habitat in more detail in a minute and how you can help provide that or enhance that. But they have to be in proximity to each other. So the floral resources must be not too far from the nesting habitat. Most bees will only travel a few meters, right? If, you know, I mean, on the tens, right, generally, to visit flowers. That's their preferred low-risk thing. They're central place foragers, they have a nest, they forage around there. So if you're working on creating resources for bees, you need to think about where the nesting resources are relative to where the floral resources are. So that's important. So we have some data on this. It's not great because you can imagine radio trackers on bees. Maybe it'll work for the big bees, but nobody really spends that kind of money except for honeybees. So for these little guys, these little tiny solitary bees, we have less information. These are usually max distances that they've been shown, right? So they're max flight limits. So some fly quite far, half a mile, but most, right, the max flight distance is like 90 feet. So most bees are going to be traveling less than 250 meters. And even that's their max. It's just that bumblebees and honeybees can travel up to 3,000. So they're going to find everything they need. But a majority of species are going to want to only forage near where they can also nest. And they're the ones that are going to be the specialists that we need to take extra care in protecting. So there's really two big approaches that I'm going to talk to you about now, and only 5 minutes each. I think I'll finish in the right amount of time. There's sort of the ecosystem approach, right, to this problem, right, to creating and promoting bee populations, right? You just say, okay, we're going to increase natural habitat to create these source populations. So around farm fields, we're not going to just have nothing or trees. We're going to have either hedgerows or we're going to have fallow fields. We're going to have places that are open in proximity to agricultural areas. And so, you know, we're going to increase the amount of early to mid-successional habitat. That's an ecological term, which is really just a fancy word for saying open, right? We're going to reduce the amount of canopy cover because bees like sun. That's where they want to forage, right? So we're going to increase the amount of prairie, meadow, scrub in the landscape. We're going to not let everything return to forest that's protected, right? And that's not easy because, right, if you want this, right, and not this, because forests play a role and bees will visit trees that flower, but once the canopy cover is complete in late spring, early summer, bees just don't penetrate in there. They really just want sun. They want to be where the sun is. And in order to have that happen, you got to work for it, right? These habitats need to be actively managed or they become forests. That's just what naturally happens in this part of the world. And your bees are sad because they can't live here, right? The resources here are just, I mean, there are some forest specialists, but they're a minority compared to most bees. So, you know, one way is you just promote, you advocate for the meadows in your maintenance of meadows in your community. And so, you know, instead of having everything be forest or just mowed grass, you say, hey, maybe we can put in a meadow here. Maybe we can put in a prairie. Maybe we can put in something that is useful in this park area. You know, support programs for hedgerows and agricultural landscapes and pollinator strips. There's already incentives out there, but, you know, always be ready to voice your support for those because they will increase the overall populations and source populations of wild bees in the environment. And then you can help to guide, another strategy is to help to guide the management of land that already needs to be managed for other reasons. And this is where my research is, and this is where my little niche in terms of bee conservation comes in, is I look at places that already need to be kept open for other reasons, things like power line corridors, roadsides, and say, can we manipulate how these areas are managed to make them even better for bees? Can we enhance, say, the flora resources, the nesting resources in those habitats that already someone else pays for them to be managed? And so these are just some of my publications on this topic. And so I work with power companies to manipulate how they manage the vegetations in their right of way, which they have to do anyway, and they spend lots and lots and lots of money to keep trees out of the line, so they got to do it anyway. But consulting and working with ecologists means that, you know, we can guide how they managed, right, to increase wildlife, increase the value of those areas to wildlife. And what does that management usually entail? What is not mowing every year, like a lot of them want to do, but it's something called integrated vegetation management, where you just target certain species that you don't want, right? Like invasive species, tall growing species. You go in there and you spot treat it with herbicide to get rid of certain species. You go in with a backpack. You don't spray the whole area. And then you just control what comes back, right? You foster some species over others. You foster the species that are going to be the most useful to you over time. And then see where that goes. So anyway, so that's the research I'm involved in, and we're making good progress. I'm currently working with PSE&G locally, and I've worked with other companies around the country to do that. And it's just great because, again, this is hundreds of millions of acres of land that can be essentially habitat reserve, little habitat reserve, not just for bees, but for butterflies, for plants, for birds. And I always, you know, usually end my research talk, which I'm not ending yet because I'm going to give you some advice personally too, a different approach for increasing bee populations. But I always say, let's make some lemonade, because people think power lines are ugly and, you know, there's scars in the landscape, and you know, they say, you know, life gives you lemons, but you know, you can take that and make it into something useful and good. And so my plea to you guys is to maybe change your attitude a little bit to power lines. Instead of looking at them as scars and environmental horribleness, actually, you know, they provide good habitat. They provide good habitat for a lot of species, and, you know, working with the power companies, you can actually do a lot of good there. And despite what you might have seen, and I've been engaged in some of this research, the lines themselves, the electromagnetic fields actually don't harm bees. It's something that's out there in the world, and it's unclear where it's coming from, but I've seen very little convincing evidence that that's true. Really no convincing evidence that it's true, at least in a practical sense. Anyway, okay, so that's one thing, that's my area of research, but overall that's sort of the more ecosystem approach. And then the personal approach is sort of what you can do in your own backyards or in your own communities. And so, you know, things you can do. You can give pollinator-friendly plants a helping hand. Get rid of some competing non-flowering invasive species, right? Don't be afraid, you know, you can select certain herbicides, or you can go with non-chemical approaches to control non-flowering invasive species in your area, in your backyard, and thereby promote the resources that can be used by bees. Plant or seed with appropriate local plants that bees love. So there's a lot of information out there, and probably whoever's coming from Xerces can give you, you can go to the Xerces website actually, and you can just target what you plant in your backyard or in your community with local plants, right, that are popular with bees and provide good resources. And so you can, there's information on this. And I say specialist bees, these are the bees that have very strong preferences, and they tend to be the ones that get hit hard by changes in the landscape. And so it's good to provide resources for them because their populations are struggling. And there's actually another document that just came out, and I'll see if we can make it available, which is specific to New York and Northeast, creating a pollinator garden for native specialist bees. And they go through in detail and give you a lot of really great advice. And this is, you know, by specialist bee, they're not usually talking about one-to-one species, but species that prefer a particular family or genus of plants. And so you can focus your efforts on planting and cultivating those. And then, you know, that's floral resources, but I always have to mention some things about nesting habitats because that's equally important and tends to be ignored. And partly because you got to have your garden be a little bit messy to be good for bees. You know, if it looks too perfect, it's not going to be providing enough in the way of nesting habitats for bees. So some things you can do, you can leave some dead stems or dead woody material lying around instead of always tidying up. You can plant or encourage shrubs that have pithy stems because a lot of bees will nest there. So elderberry, box elder, blackberries, raspberries, sumac, dogwood. You can let litter accumulate to a degree. I mean, certain species really like the cover of litter, even ground nesting species. Here's a big one. Allow patches of bare ground, especially with well-drained soils or on slopes. Because that's where your ground nesters are going to choose. And I read in that document, I didn't really think about it because I do teach about this in my animal behavior course, the way female bees navigate and find their nests after, you know, as they're going back and forth, gathering pollen and laying eggs, they look for landmarks. And they navigate using that, you know, to find their particular nest hole. So you can leave around little rocks, decorative things, decorative bits of wood, and that will actually help the female bees be able to know where their nest is, as opposed to it being a completely monotone of open soil. Leave some areas untilled, you know, if you're gardening or farming, because bees will, you know, compaction is a problem if they're building their nests, you know, so it's a mixed bag there, but you can leave some areas untilled. And then in terms of nest boxes and bee hotels, I have mixed feelings about them. I would say use them sparingly. They're good if there's no other alternatives, but bees that nest in the bee hotels are really vulnerable to predators and parasites because it's just right out in the open. It's just like, bam, you know, there's like a big sign, bees are here, you know, come in, eat me. I think that little spider at the opening of the other one. So they're quite vulnerable. So they're good in places where you just can't be messy. If you can't be messy, you can't leave any of this, get a bee hotel, and then try to make it blend in as good as possible so it doesn't stand out quite so much. And so, you know, you just want to be careful about that because they are a bit vulnerable. And if they have natural nesting spots, those are preferable. All right, I think I'm right at 3 o'clock. So this is my typical thanks to everyone on the bee team. And I can answer some questions if we have a couple minutes and there's people sticking around. Oh,
Sure. So that was great. Thanks, Kim. That was really awesome. I definitely learned a lot that I didn't know about bees. And so thank you for doing this. All right. So if you have any questions, you can go ahead and type them into the chat or in the Q&A. And we have a couple that have come in, so I will read them off. And we'll try to get to as many as we can. So one is, how do lawn fertilizers affect ground nesting bees, if they do at all?
I honestly can't say. I mean, I've never read somewhere that said that you shouldn't use them. I mean, it's, you know, I don't know that there's a direct negative effect as far as I'm aware, but I can't say that with 100% certainty. But it's not something I've read that, oh, whatever you do, don't fertilize. I've not heard that anywhere. And I think that would be something that would be an obvious thing that they would tell people if that was a big problem.
So a couple questions came in about like what plants to plant in to help bees. I did put a link into the chat for Jersey Yards, which is an organization that has lists on planting guides and things like that. If you're not in New Jersey, you could always reach out to your local extension service or a Master Gardeners program for some recommendations on native plants. And I did get a question on butterfly bushes and your thoughts on butterfly bushes, whether or not they're a good choice. I'm not sure if you have any experience with butterfly bushes, but I know I have my own answer.
Well, I mean, I do see bees on butterfly bushes. Is that what you were going to say?
Yeah, butterfly bushes I know are invasive, so they're not the best choice.
Yeah.
Because they end up out competing, and they're mainly for butterflies. They have a lot of nectar, but they don't support butterflies in other life stages, so you're not going to find caterpillars on butterfly bushes.
Yeah.
So there are better alternatives than a butterfly bush.
Mountain mint.
Yeah.
Mountain mint. The bees love mountain mint.
Mountain mint is a good one.
And I think deer avoid mint, right? Mm-hmm. So it's a good choice for New Jersey.
Yeah, mint
but yeah, butterfly. Yeah, anything invasive. Yeah, I mean the thing is, like, you know, non-native species, they can provide some resource, so they're not all bad. But as you say, if they're out competing a native, it's not great. And if you know what I mean, and they're often, even cultivars can be lower, you know, in nutritional value for bees. And so, but yeah, that's a great site that you linked to in the chat. And I would just say you can find a lot of information specific to your area if you start doing a little Googling and for what's good for bees in your area.
And then the last question that we'll take is, how could we help encourage local government to plant flowers and things on roadsides and highways, things like that? Is there anything we could be doing, any actions that could be taken to help with that?
Well, you know, I haven't been directly involved with local government. I think, you know, honestly, find out what initiatives are in place. A lot of places have good thoughts, like local government, see if they have any initiatives already in place for roadsides and medians. What you want to do is they tend to choose what they're seeding or planting based on aesthetic. And I mean, I think writing to them or finding out who's in charge of those projects and sort of suggesting that they think more carefully about resources for butterflies and bees, and as opposed to just aesthetics or monoculture, like sometimes you see and it's all one, you know, that they throw out there. I think a lot of places have initiatives already in place, but I think, you know, I mean, contact the local government and ask about it, and then see if you can get involved in sharing some information about how to make it more ecologically sound for wildlife. I'm sorry, I don't have better suggestions, more detailed than that.
There's one more question that was interesting, so I'm going to read it. Do you think that a ban on pesticides like neonicotinoids is necessary to help bee populations stay steady?
Well, I mean, it's a tough question, and it's kind of loaded. I mean, my feeling is that we need to greatly reduce the use of neonics. I mean, I think we want to, like, in very limited circumstances, maybe be allowed. I feel like there should just be greater restrictions overall. An outright ban might not be 100% necessary. The problem, though, is I guess if you don't ban it, people might abuse the loopholes. But I mean, it would go a long way if we had more tighter regulation on neonics. I think the data out of Europe shows that it really does make a difference when you make it much more difficult, right, for free use of neonics. But as I said, it's often it's a combination of chemicals, but I don't know. I mean, I would definitely lobby for more strict regulation on it. An all-out ban is controversial, but I think there should be incentives to reduce the use of that modality.
That makes sense. Okay, I think that is it. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you, Dr. Russell, for doing this. This was great. And take care. And also for anyone else who is interested, Duke Farms is open now, Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 6. Come check it out. We have lots of flowers in bloom. The goldenrod is just about to start blooming very soon. Anyone who is not able to get to Duke Farms, we do have a distance learning portal on our website that for the month of August has a bunch of pollinator and bee, meadow, monarch, butterfly resources, activities, stuff like that for kids, for families, whatever. That's all on our website, so go check that out. And thank you everyone for joining us.
Yeah,
Take
just
care.
go out and find some flowering plants and today, you know, and just look for bees. Look to see what you can see. There's a lot out there.
There is. All right, take care. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.